It's an Archaeodeath Interview with Professor Ruth Penfold-Mounce.
Welcome everybody to an Archaeodeath Interview with another exciting guest, and we're going beyond the realms of archaeology, but we're going to still be in the realms of archaeology in a sense with Ruth. Ruth, please introduce yourself to our viewers and listeners.
Hello, my name's Ruth Penfold-Mounce and I am a chair or a professor at the University of York. And although I'm a criminologist, I'm also a sociologist and I'm also into death. So that's me, really.
That's exactly the type of person I wanted to talk to. So I'm glad I didn't accidentally pick another professor of criminology at the University of York who's an interest in death, because this is brilliant, and I'm really excited because I've looked into your work and I've been following your stuff, and as these conversations are broadening out beyond people I know in the archaeology world, so much of your stuff touches on the materiality of death, heritage and death, and things that I've been struggling with and thinking about, and trying to create these morbid spaces like these YouTube videos, and so it's really a pleasure to have you here and to quiz you about all your deathly interests. But I wondered, could you give perhaps those are thinking off a career in academia, starting off in a career in academia, or just interested in these topics, how did you get into this death malarkey? How did you get into this interest that you have?
It was a complete accident, if I'm really honest. I started out doing English literature, discovered I preferred sociology. I took some crime modules because my friends were taking them. And I ended up sort of going on and developing this interest in how culture collides with crime.
Yeah.
And so my original sort of origins of research lie, believe it or not, in Gary Glitter. Okay, he's not dead, but you might be, okay, where's this going? So I was interested in looking at the relationship between celebrities and crime. And Gary Glitter was being sent to prison when I was trying to come up with my original sort of PhD project.
Yeah.
And so I started looking at celebrity and crime, and that became my PhD and sort of grounded me in criminology. But during those studies, this is when the death bit comes in. I started going into random archives and random bits of the University of Leeds library, and I came across corpse medicine.
Oh, yes. Right.
And this is where my love of death studies came in. I came across this fabulous set of cases whereby bits of the criminal dead were being kept as souvenirs, and they were sort of given special powers. They were healing powers.
Yes.
And then I came across the withered arm. Okay, so I originate from Dorset, where Thomas Hardy, the writer, comes from. So I was familiar with his work, but I hadn't come across his ghost stories. And there's this ghost story of the withered arm, whereby the heroine Gertrude has a withered, damaged arm, and she's told by a hedge witch to lay her arm on the neck of a freshly hung criminal corpse, and she would be healed. And she is, sorry, spoilers, she is healed. She dies of something else, of the shock of sort of realizing that this sort of criminal that has just healed her is actually the son of her husband. So again, spoilers on that story, but this got me totally hooked on the criminal dead. And so that is where I've branched into death studies. Bit long-winded, I'm afraid.
So we kind of, over time, it's not a new thing, we almost make celebrities out of the criminal dead, or dark celebrities, infamous. I don't know if there's a separate word for it, but we give them a special aura. But then sometimes it's taken even further to their bodies have something that they can do that other bodies can't do, and there's something like that transgression into the most damned and supposedly evil people can produce benefits through their corpses. That is well, it's all in the realm of the uncanny, isn't it? But that's particularly disconcerting but powerful. And and we're fascinated by crime, we're fascinated by the victims, but also the perpetrators and of different kinds of offence, and what they become sort of celebrities, even if they weren't celebrities before, after their offences. It's a really curious mix. I can't get my head around it all.
Absolutely, and I think what's really interesting is we sort of take the notorious dead, if we'll sort of label them as that, these
Yeah,
awful dead criminals, and we given them these special sort of powers. But one interesting contrast to the relics of the saints, the
yes,
most pure, the healing powers of people who have been designated sort of as saints.
yeah,
They can heal,
yeah,
but so can their polar opposite, the criminal dead. I mean, I just think it's almost it's almost funny how
yeah.
the darkness and light can both be given these sort of special powers. And I mean, with the criminal dead, I mean, it's not just about sort of laying a damaged limb on a freshly hung sort of criminal. It's consuming the dead. So we've actually got some cannibalism here. It's about I hate to say it, but drinking their blood. It can be warm, it can be cold, it can be powdered, it can be put into things. That the body fat can be used, the skin of the dead. Pregnant women, if they wear a belt of skin made from an executed criminal, will reduce their labor pains. I mean, the list goes on, and some of these sort of tendencies were sort of going in the UK were happening right up into the early sort of 1930s, 40s. There's some quite dark stuff that's been going on, and like you say, there is that sort of celebrification,
Mm,
of these criminals. So they might not have been super famous in life,
mm.
but in death, they actually get this celebrity status.
So would you I mean, I don't know about categories of these things, but would you call this a folklore of the criminal corpse, or how would you relate this belief versus sort of, more, because it's not, none of this is sort of in any doctrine of any faith. It's all floating around the relationship between society and story. And I don't know would folklore be a term that you would appropriate or use in this context, or?
I think there is an element of the folk lore that comes in here and that sort of superstition, but we've also got elements of the Gothic as well.
Yeah,
I just ran an event earlier this week with Lizzie Seal. She's another criminologist who does a lot of archival research, and what's really interesting with that is actually how sort of interdisciplinary approaches to the understandings of death is just so important. It's so vital not to stay in your own discipline or your own field, because death is all encompassing. It
yeah,
crosses so many boundaries in so many ways. Um, and I think it gives a real sort of hook to students and the public in actually connecting with research, because folklore and superstitions and notions of sort of magic and special powers, people connect with that, students connect with that. So
yeah.
it's a really brilliant sort of tool for connecting research outside of the ivory towers of academia, which is my favorite place to work, really.
And Ruth, it very much links to what you talk about in your book about not to discount or dismiss the popular media representations of the dead, and how our news media as well, is full of the dead in different regards, beyond the celebrities and the sort of afterlife of notorious corpses. And there is actually we're saturated with death in our media and social media, and you really get into that and talk about zombies as a case study. I really enjoyed that, because I'm getting into the zombies in my own sort of research on the side. But I just think that's really important, isn't it? That we shouldn't just discount that, as that's an important part of how we engage with mortality, isn't it, I suppose?
Absolutely, I see it as a bridge, and it's like particularly when people study or think about death, they tend to think about palliative care. They're thinking about end of life processes. They're thinking about the reality of death, that people do die, what we do with their bodies, all of those sorts of things. Whereas my work tends to be in the lighter end of death, if that makes sense, because it's about the representation of death, and I think it's almost that playful notion of death. So yes, zombies, the undead, vampires, these are the dead that won't stay dead. They're not staying where they've been put,
Yeah,
in the ground. They're coming back. They are the unruly dead, and they are this this tool, I suppose, for people to connect with death. And I don't think always people think when they sort of watch this sort of stuff or consume this popular culture representations of death, they're not necessarily thinking the most in-depth thoughts about their own mortality, but
Yeah.
they are being faced with forms of mortality and
Yeah.
decay.
Yeah.
And that fear of death, the very fact that some of our most deeply rooted folkloric monsters are the ones that are dead and they come back from the dead, says a lot about society and a lot about culture, that death is this boundary that's fearful. It's a limbo state. It is a liminal space or a morbid space. You referred to that earlier on, and it's something
Yes.
I'm really keen to talk about and think about. It's that notion of having these morbid spaces. It can be a cemetery, it could be a morgue, but we have these other morbid spaces where we talk about and engage with death. This podcast, I would say, is a form of morbid space. We're talking about morbid death-related issues.
I mean, I've got a long-running separate series on my YouTube channel where I am in conversation with that rebel rabbi who's a South Californian Jewish theologian, and she and I talk about the death and mortality / immortality themes in Doctor Who in the Revive series. So we've gone series by series talking about how, even in this very, fabulous time traveling, otherworldly and sometimes this worldly universe, different themes of mortality are being engaged with, and the immortal and the mortal are both fictional ways in which people tackle that issue, I think. But also I think zombies are that very in that very space between. They live on, but they when they shouldn't be, and that's uncanny. But also if it's a very fantastical, it's somehow grounded and rooted in a way people can connect to, particularly when they're wandering around mundane spaces, and places we can relate to. And we could use that in so many ways in our engagement and education, rather than just the zombie phenomenon itself as a media and pop culture reference. It can take us back to our academic fields and allow students and others to sort of get our concepts they might not otherwise have got, or appreciate. That's what I think, anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to hear about the sort of the Doctor Who thing as well. I think it's brilliant because it's yet another example of how a popular culture can be this bridge, this tool for people to connect to bigger issues.
Yeah.
And some of my work, it's quite a long time back now, I developed the idea or the concept of glossy topics. The
Yeah.
idea of something that is quite sort of or perceived as frivolous, like popular culture,
Yeah.
celebrity, those sorts of things, but actually they have a very serious undertone. They can connect us to things, the big issues of life and culture and faith and fears and hopes. And it's a space whereby people find themselves able to make those connections. And it always worries me sometimes that, particularly in academia, in research, we're doing really worthy stuff. It's heavy stuff, big issues. But how do we do that? I hate to say it, it's dreadful. It's the big pressure of academia, with that sort of impact work.
Yeah.
And it's like things that root back to popular culture, those spaces and places that people, the general population, connect to is absolutely crucial. And I think that's why looking at things like zombies, people can roll their eyes at it. My students love it once they get their heads around it, because it's that springboard. It's a catalyst to engage with bigger issues, and it's like a friendly, safe space. Although zombies aren't particularly friendly or safe, but they're not real. There aren't zombies in the world, so it's that slight disconnect. It gives us that sort of lens to look at big issues, but we're in a safe space because we're not faced with perhaps our own mortality or our loved ones, or the reality of disposing of the dead, or grieving, but we are dealing with those issues. So I think it's an absolutely vital and important space.
Absolutely, and it sensitive about whatever you say on certain topics will get us into trouble on social media. I know this isn't a live broadcast. I'm suddenly was thinking that way, but when we see those metaphors being deployed to refer to the kind of living death that people face in particular zones of the world where they're either by climate change or environmental catastrophes or by warfare and they are living in a kind of between world state, and that has been discussed as a concept to help it articulate the plight of particular groups of people. I think it is a real tangible metaphor and theme to take from the fictional world back into our real world scenarios. But I also like the when we're thinking about how we get into the real world, the physical world. Your book is more about fiction, media, but you've also done a lot of work thinking about actual real death spaces, death heritage, and dark tourism, and those themes within our actual physical spaces and environments. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about your mobility, death mobilities work that connects it back to the world in which we live, as it were, rather than sort of fiction.
Yeah. So a few years back, I got introduced to walking methods. It was from a colleague, Professor Maggie O'Neill, who's now over at the University of Cork. And she used to do, at her various sort of places that she worked, she used to use walking methods to gather data. And when she came to my department and worked here for a while, we worked with a team of undergraduates and PhD students and other colleagues on developing the York Crime Walk. So bear with me, there's a story here.
Okay.
And the York Crime Walk is a sort of podcasted, self-guiding walk around York. And at different points on a map, we give you different stopping points. You listen to different podcasts and you learn about crime and criminal justice in the city of York. Now, I have other interests other than just crime, and there were so many stories to tell. So I developed a death walk, a death and culture walk, and I've embedded this in my morbidity, culture and corpses third year module. And my students all have to go off and they have to listen to the various podcasts. They have to do a walk around York, and effectively they've got an outdoor classroom. And this was really useful during COVID, I have to say, because the students could still do learning, and they got to know their city. So when they were allowed out of their rooms and in some of their bubbles, they'd trot off on this walk. And if they couldn't take someone with them, they used to take them on their phone. So I've had students listening to podcasts as they walk around York, and taking their friends as well. So there's this great sort of community that's sort of been building up by using this sort of podcasted tool. And I mean, we cover things from Victorian funeral biscuits to sort of Dick Turpin, who of course was executed and buried here in York. You can go and visit the cholera burial ground and learn about the riots in York and fears about catching things from just seeing the dead, through to we've got sort of Victorian memorial cards. We cover so many different issues. And we've deliberately designed this walk so we can add further podcasts to it in the future if we wish to, so that we can add a sort of almost like archive of voices of people who sort of done research. And our students can just drop in and listen in to these various sort of bits of information and research. They seem to really like it.
So can I clarify, did you come up with this as a remedy for the COVID situation, or was it already something you were developing and it happened to be up and running and working during COVID?
It was actually just before. So we launched the Death Walk just before sort of COVID, probably about 9 months before, and the Crime Walk had come before that. So we had these sort of tools to help our students sort of learn, and they were designed as pedagogic tools, so designed to be a sort of a teaching tool that we've embedded into various modules. But we've also sort of written and recorded the sort of short podcasts that are quite structured, so that it's not too conversational, which is a shame, I think, but it is there as sort of a learning tool. But it's also for the members of the public, so it is available for them people to take. And we have the York Festival of Ideas every year here in York, and so it's an annual event where we encourage people to sort of go and do this walk. But it is available, so it's one of the things I think I'm really proud of, is that it's about research, but it's for our students and it's for the public as well.
And there's always I get one of the many things that I either hear directly or I hear whispers of dismissing these digital products is, they're short term. But what you're talking about is a resource that can run as long as any published guide or book, or probably longer than many of these guides will sit in little slots in a tourist center or something. This is there, and it could potentially be still not out of date. I don't know what they're still up fresh, potentially a decade or two in the future, because it's a potentially replicable, and you can augment it, and
Absolutely. And we really worked hard to design it so that it wouldn't date too rapidly. And we are drawing on the history of York. York, it's a beautiful ancient city, as I'm sure you are well aware.
Yes.
And so we draw on that, thousands of years worth of history. And then in the sort of, particularly when we teach in the classroom, we make those connections between the past and bring that into the present to make those connections, which again, I think is really important, because we need to be learning from the past, and making those connections to the present. And social science can sometimes get a bit caught up in change. Everything's changing so fast.
Yes.
And it's like, yes, there's lots of change, but actually using the digital, we can bring the past and really make this clear connection into the present and the contemporary. Again, something I'm really passionate about.
I think that's really important, because so often we exoticize and other the past, or we go to the other extreme and just say, well, people are just like us, there was no difference. And I think both have their dangers and misuses in popular culture, but the connections are the key thing. Recognizing both the shared humanity and mortality and the experiences of death, obviously, but then also recognizing that despite the many dangers of our world, we're not all dying of cholera on the daily, and that is
absolutely. Absolutely, but something like, cholera, we might not be dying of cholera. And Jon Snow, who, not the Game of Thrones Jon Snow, obviously, but the original Doctor in Jon Snow, was actually born on North Street. And he was the one who discovered that cholera was waterborne, and he was Queen Victoria's doctor, but he was born in York on North Street. And so we can tell his story, and it tells the story about health and illness and society and all of those other issues. And I think what's also been, again, that I'm proud of with this walk is actually how versatile it's become, not only for the students in my department, but I've got colleagues in other departments who've also used this walk. So over in archaeology here at York, they've actually used the walk on one of their master's programs, sent the students off on it. And in education as well. So it's really encouraging that actually people can see the potential in that interdisciplinary approach. And again, history, it affects us all, every discipline. So you can listen to those podcasts and then springboard it into what you need students to be thinking about.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but it's not the same voice on these podcasts. It's a plethora of different perspectives.
Absolutely. So in the York Crime Walk, you have a number of narrators who it was really hard work, I have to be really honest, whereby there are a number of our voices, and we sort of interchanged as we were telling these stories, but we found that's really hard to edit beautifully. So when we did the Death Walk, we thought, right, we'll learn from this, and we're going to learn from the National Trust and English Heritage, who, when you go and visit one of their properties, you get an audio guide and you get short, contained podcast. So we adopted that for the Death Walk, which means we can add in, and it means that we could represent multiple researchers and their voices. So one of my favorite podcasts is by Louis, who worked for the York Archaeological Trust, and he talks all about the archaeology in York. It's at Micklegate Bar, where his podcast is based, and he sort of draws in these sort of different sort of expertise and knowledge. So we have, it's not just people that I know in my department. We have a variety of backgrounds as well.
And for those who can't walk or can't be in York to walk, it's on. The whole point is it's online, it's accessible. You've got the map. It can sit as a virtual product in and of itself.
Absolutely. So you can just Google York Crime Walk or York Death and Culture Walk, and you will find the site, and you can listen to the podcast wherever you like, when you're having a glass of wine or a cup of coffee at home. Again, we found that really helpful. And again, our students have appreciated that as well, particularly for students who've got accessibility issues or, mobility issues. So it's sort of, again, designed to be really accessible. I've got colleagues at the University of Bath who I've been working with, where the Centre for Death and Society is, and they're designing their own walk, which I've been liaising with them on as well. So it's fantastic to see that other sort of universities are seeing the potential of developing these walks for their own cities. But I'm really looking forward to listening to the podcast so I can learn more about Bath.
And it's those two case studies you've just mentioned, your own and this developing one at Bath, obviously cities, historic cities, rich cities. But I'd love your thoughts on how this could be applied to countryside and to other kinds of scale of landscape, maybe even individual cemeteries. I believe you, in your recent paper, you did cite one about a cemetery. I can't remember, maybe it was in the States. But this isn't simply about cityscapes, is it? This can be applied elsewhere.
Absolutely. It was actually a student, a master student from that archaeology program I was telling you about, did the walk, enjoyed it so much. When they went home to the United States, they got work in a cemetery and set up their own podcasted walk. So, there's lots of good connections there. And I was thrilled to hear about that. And you see the sort of development of QR codes often on sort of grave markers now, where you can learn more about people. And I know that there are sort of no limits to how these sort of podcasted walks are happening. Particularly in cemeteries, there's more of a tendency to have that sort of guided walk. So you'd be there in person and you'd have a guide who'd lead you around and sort of tell you these stories. But there is this shift towards the digital. I think people are seeing the potential in it. And I certainly know that on the, when I mentioned earlier that the education department who used my sort of death walk, they got their students who were an international cohort during COVID, so a lot of them weren't in the UK, they designed their own podcasts relating to key issues and they put it onto a map all around the world. So it's not just located to one city or a cemetery or anywhere else. You can really do this to any scale you want.
I see the benefits in that, particularly thinking of, I've already been, for my own teaching, I take students to a lot of different churchyards where I can touch on not only different stories of individual graves and styles of grave, but also the geography of the churchyards, how they contrast with each other. And I haven't done it in a podcast format, but I've been sort of through a mixture of blogs and video, vlogs. I've been sort of giving them guided resources to see. Sort of, we're building a portfolio of sort of more and more Cheshire and Flintshire and Wrexham county churches, so that they, each year, as well as those that go on the field trips with me, they have this sort of bank of resources but that's less, shall we say, slick and produce. But I think there's lots of ways that we can do this kind of sort of direct people around, showing them the variety of different mortuary environments that we can find in our localities. It can be a really powerful tool for the public to access this stuff. And again, I sound defensive, but people have often said to me, well, but who's going to access this? Who's going to watch this? But it's amazing how people do drop in and find this stuff, even if they're not avid podcasters or avid blog readers or vlog readers. They come across, if they have a local interest, local people, it's an amazing number of local people go, oh yes, you're the guy that wrote that blog post a while ago. And I suppose that happens as well, isn't it? That people just will find it.
Absolutely. And I think this is something that, as the sort of sociologist in me really starts to think about the fact that, we are seeing a shift in how people engage with information.
Yes.
The rise of the digital. We talk about this, we're in a digitized society, and our global community, we're also interconnected, but this is really happening, and we are seeing people increasingly wanting to sort of dip in and dip out. They don't necessarily want to come physically and listen to something for a whole hour and do a Q&A.
No.
There is still a market for that, but people like this. Oh, I want to be doing my hoovering, but I want to be doing something else, and I'm going to listen to something, not just music anymore. I want to expand my mind, or deal with sort of issues. And I think there's so much material out there. People are just dipping in and dipping out, and people are curious, and so they've got this great range of resources.
May I shift to a slightly different but related topic of the broader issue of pedagogy, how we teach death? Because the podcast is a great case study of how you teach death, because this is about engaging all manner of publics, but also your students in these spaces. But I'd love to hear more about your broader experiences, the challenges and the opportunities of dealing with teaching these topics, which can be quite not necessarily predictably triggering and sensitive for individuals. I've faced this over the last 25 years of teaching, and I'm sure you have too. But obviously, I deal with actual images and a lot more graphic and tangible traces than perhaps it's not more difficult for me, but it's just a different set of things. But I'd just love to hear your thoughts on challenges and opportunities.
Yeah, it is. Working in the area of death is challenging. Gathering your own research is challenging, but then teaching it is very challenging. And I think some of it over the years I've learned is to be really upfront about things.
Yeah.
So I run a specialist module, as I said earlier, morbidity, culture and corpses. It's a third-year module. It's a really popular module. And yes, I have my death walk embedded in it, but the topics that we cover range from the undead through to disposing of the dead. We do grieving, marginal grieving. So that will be about fetal loss, stillbirth. So, weighty, sensitive issues, right through to public grieving. So, grieving for the Queen, for example. So we cover a whole range of these big issues. But there's one particular week that I think offers particular challenges. And that's when we deal with the politics and ethics of looking at pictures. And through this, we do put up various sort of warnings for our students, that this is difficult, all of those sorts of things. But when our students sign up for this module, we do make it clear from the start, this is what you're going to be facing in this module. And we're not going to be warning you about everything. Take this as the whole thing is difficult and sensitive. The ethics and sort of politics of the image, it's right down to what we should be looking at, what we shouldn't, what the ethical questions and moral questions are behind that. And the students find it really challenging because we are showing pictures of violence that's been committed against the dead. We are looking at pictures that are distressing, and we're getting students to question whether they should be looking. What are the boundaries? How should this be distributed? Is this art? Is this news? All of those sorts of things. And what I find really rewarding from that is how the students really do get it. Something clicks in their head once you start to challenge them. That this isn't just about, being a voyeur. You're just looking at this stuff and consuming it because it's graphic and horrible. Actually, no, there are some deep-seated issues to go with it. So we sort of flag that up front and center at the start of the teaching, so that then as we go through it and deal with all these more sort of other issues, they've already got that in their head. And we get them to sort of, part of the assessment is about a reflection. They have to reflect on what they've learned and their practices. And I think that's really helpful in the students processing what they're being taught and how they're learning it, but also then how they can be sensitive in terms of how they talk and how they are respectful of what they are encountering. We do have the playful weeks, but we do have those sort of weighty subjects as well.
See, I mean, humour is something that I don't think we shouldn't treat lightly, but I mean, but we have to include humour. We can't. I mean, I've just had to in a union capacity deal with a lot of nursing lecturers and support them in a situation, and surprise, I've realised someone who's used to talking about death, suddenly casual conversations with any nursing lecturer or midwifery lecturer, rapidly turn into dark humour because they, and when you're dealing with students, you can't keep this kind of undertaker-like sobriety and just Stanner, today we're going to talk about death and it might upset you. You've got to. There's young people often with a range of different backgrounds and interests. You've got to be light about it sometimes. It can't be all that heavy. And I want you to look very serious and concerned when we look at these images. It's got to be within bounds where you adapt to the group, but equally it's got to be about respect as well, and it's not about mocking the dead, but it's about joking about the circumstances or our reactions as much as we certainly wouldn't encourage anyone to have the dead as the butt of jokes, but it's about humor cannot be avoided, I feel. But I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
I think the humour is really important. You know, my husband is actually a palliative care doctor,
Okay.
so you know, I have that sort of connection with him. You know, actually how he has to process things, and when you know, with his sort of his team, and that sort of dark humor is part of how they are dealing with the sadness and the trauma. And it
Yeah.
isn't that it's not respectful, but it's
No.
about them being able to process and continue working long term in a very difficult area. But as part of the sort of my sort of background with that sort of popular culture representations of the dead, I think this is where I get my students to really think about humor. Because when I'm getting them to think about popular culture representations of death, I get them to think about, and this is showing my age, I'm afraid, Howard, back in the 80s, Weekend at Bernie's. I don't know if you can remember that, but you've got living characters whose boss has died, and they, you know, they're worried about being knocked off by hitmen, who their boss Bernie, who is the dead body throughout the film, is, you know, he'd set this hitman up to kill these two lads, and you know, it's all that sort of complicated plot. But the whole story is about this corpse going around with them, going to parties and going swimming, and it's like, this is really dark stuff.
Yeah.
And yet it's deeply humorous as well.
Yeah.
So I think, you know, it's important to remember and look at examples of how the dead can be used or are used in dark humor, and that there are different boundaries, and where the boundaries are. Where do you draw a line between what is funny and acceptable or
Yeah.
questionable, and when it's like no? So I think it's really important to think about that. But popular culture, again, is a really useful tool for that.
And I presume these are, while you have a structure, you have plans like we all do with our modules and our individual classes, you have to adapt to the group you're facing, don't you? I mean, if you are made aware, or you know someone is going through bereavement, or we all have to pivot all the time, I feel, and just be, you know, sensitive, read the room, whether it's in a classroom or in an online space. We've got to sort of not necessarily pivot, but we've got to adapt at least to some extent. I don't know how you feel about that.
Oh, I hear you, and I totally agree. And sort of having students in the room who perhaps do undergo a bereavement during the module, and then
Yes.
find that actually, you know, learning about this stuff is just too much, and
Yes.
yet often in university structures, they're locked into the module and they've
Yeah.
got to be assessed on it. And so they're going to have to be assessed on something that's related with death. Now, this is where I think the importance of popular culture comes in,
Yeah.
because we've built in a week or two, which is lighter touch, still deals with the big issues, but it's a safer, morbid space for those students to work in. So when we have students who say, well, I can't possibly do the assessment on this module. I can't look at the grieving questions. I can't look or think about, you know, disposing of the dead. So we encourage them to think about either some of the theories about death denial, which, you know, is some distance from the reality of death, or we get them to think about popular culture. So we kind of have a safety net for those students,
That's really
because
good.
you don't know what people are going through or could
No.
go through. So it's like, let's have a backup plan. And the students that sort of come to us and say, look, you know, I've just lost you know, a member of my family, I can't do this. We direct them to this, and it's always worked so far. They found that really helpful, because most students who've chosen this module and want to study death are deeply committed to understanding death and disposal and grieving. But it's much harder when that's something that's very fresh for you. So we do have that sort of way
That's
out.
That's really good and constructive. And I suppose you get to hear anecdotes from every student's personal experience, because young people, many may not have encountered many deaths type directly, but everyone's got a story of some, even if it's their reaction to pop culture itself. You know, everyone's got a story that they can bring.
Absolutely. You know, the very first sort of week when I meet with these students, I always say, so why did you pick this module? And I get them all to share. And you know what the recurring theme is? Death's taboo. No one talks about it. And it's
Apart
like,
from the fact we do.
oh, but we do. And it's everywhere. And I find it a really useful, again, a springboard, because I'm able to say death is not taboo.
No.
It's uncomfortable territory. But
Yes.
death is everywhere. You know, you will die. your families will die, your pets will die.
Oh no, don't say that.
Sorry, but death is inevitable, and
Yeah.
it's experienced in different ways. And look at popular culture, it is everywhere.
Yeah.
When students, I get them to try and think about how much death they've observed in popular culture in a week. And if they start to try and count it up, they lose count really quickly. So yeah, I think it's an interesting one.
I think the only time there's been two times in teaching death modules of my own design over 20 these years. I don't know, I can't remember how many years. When did I first teach this? 1999, 2000. Yeah, so I suppose I've been teaching death in one form or another for that 25 years, right? So there's two moments to come to mind. I'm sure there were others where I really felt, and when a family member was just diagnosed with what I thought at the time was terminal illness, and I had to literally go in and teach about stuff, and that affected me. And the other one, and no one knew, and I just did it, and it's just what you have to do, isn't it? But the other one I wanted to share was I had a student who was a mature student in the times when mature students had more access to higher education than they do now, and she was a very troubled person because she was basically looking after caring a principal carer as well as a first-rate student, a principal carer for her husband who was clearly heavily disabled and in the last stages of life. And I used to get in, it was a 9 a.m. class, and I used to get in there like early to prep, and she would always be there like 8. I couldn't get early enough to just get the slides up and get everything ready. And I'd make up a name like, "Hi, Joanne, how are you?" "I'm all right, although, of course, we had to clear up this mess last night, and then, of course, he fell over in his chair, and, of course, the doctor says he's only got 6 months, and of course, the machine doesn't work, and then we had to get the ambulance out." And it would be just like this tirade for like 20 minutes, and I just like go, "Okay, right, this week it's cremation." And I always felt, by the time 9 a.m. started, I felt I needed therapy. And I was providing a service for her, because obviously this was her only outlet to get away from the home, doing the part-time degree and talking to anyone about it. So I suppose indirectly I was helping, but I didn't know what to say, because there's not much you can say when it's just like a tirade. But anyway, my point is that we are affected. Well, I was going with this. So that was where we are affected too, aren't we? We are trained and experts in dealing with death, but that doesn't mean we're not human and we can't be affected, especially when things come unexpected to us. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Absolutely. I mean, it's we aren't trained as counselors. Well, most of us won't be trained as
No.
counselors, and yet sometimes you will get that sort of big outpouring of real suffering and
Yes.
struggles and grief. And I suppose it's like any piece of research when you've got to fill in the old ethics form, and you've got to put about how you're going to protect the participants, but how you're going to protect the researcher. And I think this is something we need to be thinking about when we teach in certain areas as well, is actually how do we look after ourselves in that sort of environment? Because it's fantastic that perhaps a student feels able to share and be honest, but also, like you say, it's like, well, what do you do with this when you suddenly got to switch into performance mode in a lecture and talk about, like you say, cremation? So I think some of it's about that sort of, actually how we learn to process and look after ourselves when we deal with some of these really difficult issues. One of my colleagues who's taught on the morbidities module did a lot of work around fetal loss and that sort of marginalized grieving. And, when she underwent her own pregnancy, that was too much sort of teaching and working in that area for her. So boundaries had to be drawn. So it's okay, well, we work around that. But again, you have to be, as the individual who's teaching or researching this area, you do have to consider and put in place some ways of processing, even if it's right, I'm going to go and work out in the gym or go for a run, or I'm going to go home and stroke my dog and just have a cup of tea. You need to think about how you're going to actually look after yourself.
I have a
bit of a cliche, isn't it, really?
No, it's important. It's important. And I think, thank you for that answer. And it makes me think about another myth. You said myth of taboo, of the death is taboo, and it's not. But I wondered whether you have any thoughts, or there is in circles that I'm not familiar with in your academic expertise and fields, there's more of a discussion of this, a kind of a myth. It's not really a myth, because but I've been hearing, and I don't know how to react to it myself. So I'm generally asking, what you think, because I've heard a kind of a narrative being constructed now is that COVID has transformed our relationship with the dead. And yes, of course, COVID did make. I mean, I experienced this personally, and in fact, my family, we couldn't have a funeral for one person who passed away, and there was never a memorial service, because by the time it came around, it seemed like that moment had gone. And and that's a broader issue, and I'm not dismissing that, but surely a lot of what then people then mobilize and then talk about are things that actually have a deeper history in the trajectories of late 20th century, late 20th, early 21st century death in society. But I don't know if you've got any reflection on that point of COVID has transformed the way we deal with the dead. I'm not denying it hasn't. I'm not saying it. Yeah, but I'm just saying, I don't know. It just seems like a bit of a oversimplification for me. And I wonder if that's on the basis of a new sort of myth that's building, that, COVID is like a line in the sand, where now we're in a post-COVID world where the dead are something other than they were in 2018 or whatever. I don't know.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting point. I think COVID drew a global population's attention to death and mortality.
Yes.
And I think people aren't comfortable looking directly into the face of their own mortality or the mortality of their loved ones. So I think COVID forced people to think through death in a lot more detail and on a mass scale in a very intense time period. And I think it sped up certain traits that were already starting to emerge.
Yeah.
So we now see it's quite commonplace to have a funeral or memorial service being live streamed for people who can't attend.
Yes.
For example, a couple of years back, that was not a thing. Not a thing. Now it's like, oh, I can't make that distance, I'll just tune in. That's, I think, we're seeing the rise of the digital here. That's certainly something that's there. We're also seeing the rise of sort of online grieving, I suppose. This is something that was already building up, but it's it's not just obituaries being sort of released in like newspapers now, whether it's local or national if it's famous. But it's like light a candle on a Facebook page or any of those sorts of things, or making death announcements to family members that somebody has died. It's often like through Facebook, for example. All your contacts are there. Why would you write to them? Email seems impersonal, but you could do a nice photo and a friendly announcement of the death of someone through social media. So again, I think it's perhaps not that COVID has caused these things, but I think it has sort of exacerbated or sped them up and normalized the rise of the digital in line with how we deal with death.
And in our university, I don't know if this is something that you're happy to answer, but in terms of, because I'm not asking you to represent your university position on this, because universities are so reputationally sensitive, and I've certainly had situations I can give you an example of, if that's, but maybe not in detail, but of where opportunities for conversations with communities and with students about death have been curtailed by the fear of disciplinary and perceived negative, reputationally damaging public news about the sensitive areas. And I know that your university has, in my field, has had such an incident a couple of years ago where, but I've also had incidents, where the university's reaction is one, oh, this may make us look bad, rather than, oh, this is an opportunity to show how our lecturers are being innovative and engaging students and engaging publics in a topic that should be at the top of our national conversation type of thing. Do you see what I'm saying? So I don't know how you feel you sit in that balance between, we obviously have to be responsible, we obviously have to be check ourselves in what we say and how we behave, but equally I do wonder about the balance here between fear of reputational damage versus opportunities to drive these conversations forward as both academics and activists in those public spheres. I don't know if I'm making myself clear at all, but thoughts anyway.
Yeah, no, I get what you're saying. I haven't encountered too many instances like that, but there is one example that springs straight to mind. A couple of years ago, myself and some colleagues were running the Death and Culture conference here at York,
Okay.
and the Queen died right in the middle of the conference. It
Yes.
was announced, and suddenly we had a lot of questions from the universities, because there's 2 universities in York and they were hosting this conference. It was immediately those questions about, should this conference continue? Is it respectful to be talking about death when the Queen has just died and we're going into national mourning? And we had to sort of just have some quite firm conversations back and say, the study of death is, we're being critical about death here. This isn't
Yeah.
some sort of big celebration of death. This is thinking about research in this area. And actually, the fact that the Queen has died in the middle of this conference is not a reason to stop those conversations and stop and close down that research. And actually, we continued with it and it was okay.
Good.
But it was the first time where there was that sort of, reputationally, is this a problem or a risk? That's the first time I'd really encountered that. And actually, universities were really good about it.
I'm sure, but the fact without being critical of your institution, the fact that we have to have those conversations, because with the best will of the world, the scale and the noise that can be of outrage that can be created over even the minorest perceived infraction or disrespect that contrived out of almost nothing, it can, it's worth having those conversations, because we've seen how it can rapidly spiral out of control. So yeah, that's a really interesting example about a conference. I hadn't really thought about that. Mine was actually, I can see how I share this, I'll simpler version, but about a decade ago I used to do graveyard surveys with my students as a training exercise and as part of a death and burial module, and there was an incident where a mourner at a grave in the cemetery put in a formal complaint to the university. Now, did we do anything wrong? No, we didn't. And I emphatically explained to the proctor of the university that the students had done nothing wrong. I had done nothing wrong, other than we had used our voices to communicate with each other in a cemetery space. There is no auditory volume, max or limit. We weren't saying anything inappropriate, but we were doing an active survey and we were clearly part of a group. But the dynamic, equally, from the flip side, from the mourner's perspective, she had seen us come up to one of the students, said, "Excuse me, where are you from?" And they'd honestly and politely answered and hadn't said anything further, walked off and wrote an angry email about how our presence was insulting to her and her newly bereaved status and the grave of her child. There's no way that I can say that she was wrong to feel upset, because I could imagine seeing any group doing anything, cutting trees, having lunch, could cause her to write that kind of email. But there was no ability to resolve. And the dynamic went that I said, I want to have a chat with this lady and explain what we were doing, apologize if need be, but explain that this is really important for us to train the students in a practical skill, but also engage them with the history of death in this really important historic cemetery. And there was no opportunity to do that because it was a reputational complaint, and at that point there was no going back. And so I never heard, but I bet the university wrote her something generic. And then years later we had a meeting and a conversation with the lady, and she said how furious she was at my institution because they only gave her a generic, "Oh, I'm sorry you feel you're upset." And I was offering an opportunity to not apologize for something I didn't do wrong, but to have a conversation with her and to say, look, no way was this, am I questioning your upset and your situation, but here's what we were trying to do. What can we do in future? My point is, and she apologized to me for even writing that email. And I said, no, I see from your perspective what was happening. I knew that from the second, from the get, when I saw your message, this was sincere, this was heartfelt, but she said, it was a place of anger though. I just lost, I totally understand. And we completely resolved it, and it was really constructive. But the fear and the structures didn't allow even a basic conversation to resolve the issue. And it made me think how many opportunities we're missing. And so many local talk, I'm going on a rant here, but so many local talks where people come up to me and go, that Bronze Age burial you showed, or that Anglo-Saxon period burial you showed, that really reminds me of when my mum died, when my father died, when my brother died. And I get that all the time. And it's, anyway, I'm just sort of offloading sort of some reflections on, we really, people want these conversations. And even if it's ancient remains, they want to talk to us and they want to hear our perspectives. But,
Yeah,
it's not always
absolutely.
possible.
It isn't always possible, and it's that you sort of example there is a really, really important, intriguing situation, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because you have got this collision between someone who had the right to be upset, sort of research and teaching, but
Yes.
also universities. And it is about trying to appreciate where everybody is coming from, because you can understand why a university does need to protect itself.
Yes. Yes.
And that's part of it. It's a huge institution and reputation is important.
Yeah.
But also, just because you're working or teaching in an area that's difficult doesn't mean you should be shut down. So yeah, it's a tricky one.
It is a tricky one. And let's just say that I was really delighted because I was deeply upset and angry, and I went over everything I'd said, trying to remember what I'd said, how I'd been, where geographically I'd precisely been, and I'd worked out we weren't near the grave, but we were, again, the perception of proximity. For someone for them, that's their space with a grave that they're not sort of someone who died in 1899. They're sort of I'm so outraged that the cemetery is cutting a bush next to the grave of my great grandfather. It's not like that kind of angry to local newspaper. This is something very recent for her. And but anyway, the point is, it's an opportunity to a lost on my part, because I was fearful of how it would go, but also the universities, because we are public institutions and we have local communities as well as international communities. And likewise, I've said things online that people are really jarred, and they said, from a perspective of this background, this is not the way I would think about it. And you go, and sometimes it's constructive and you can have, right. And sometimes it's just going in a very angry direction and there's no conversation to be had. But, again, we have to be sensitive to these matters while not stifling ourselves too much, because these are areas that are important, I feel.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just a very fine line to walk.
Absolutely. And what do you I would like to ask you about the future of what you feel is the direction of this kind of interdisciplinary area of research that you're doing. What kind of, I don't want to divulge in this conversation, but what kind of things do you think we've not addressed yet?
Oh, that's going to floor me, that question.
I'm sorry.
I think the next steps, for me, some of the things that I'm most interested in working on now, I think, is to come up with a much clearer plan about sort of that sort of teaching in sensitive areas or researching in sensitive areas. I have a lot of not only sort of undergraduates and sort of postgraduates on sort of master's programs, but then PhD students who are wanting to work, research, and talk about things that are in difficult areas such as death. And there doesn't seem to be a huge amount of sort of really clear guidance about how to handle this well. It's a lot more sort of, who's mentoring you, that sort of thing. So for me, I think that's the next sort of big project. The next big thing is to come up with something that is just clear and more applicable more broadly for people who are thinking and working in these sort of difficult areas.
That's really important, because I feel I've ranted about this issue before, and I've just recently read an article by an academic who's well known but will remain nameless, saying that there's a bit of an obsession with guidelines and a bit of obsession with, and I understand the critique of, well, you can't, every time you created guidelines, you're stifling or directing or making a formula. But honestly, if you're a student trying to enter these areas, you need something. And whether it's I've one of the themes that I'm interested in is online guidelines for how to behave in relation to the archaeological dead online, showing images, how we talk about the remains, the terms we use. And I sort of navigated my own route, but I also see things that other archaeologists do, and I wince and I go, really, are we doing that now? And I know, so yeah, I think if you are a student, there's no point in telling people off after the event. You need something for them to give them that, particularly across disciplines as well, where there's different traditions. So absolutely.
Yeah, and I think also about giving some support and clearer guidance on methods for actually doing research in this area, because you can't talk to the dead. Well, we're not going to go down that question of can you talk to the dead. Let's just assume that you can't talk to the dead because they're
Yes.
dead. So how can you gather data in this sort of area that isn't just, say, opinions or representations? And I think, if you're an undergraduate, for example, how do you research into death? There are methods, and and we have a lot of our students who are trained in, particularly in social science, they're trained in our traditional quants and quals types of methods. But there's arts and humanities type methods that would work much better for doing research in sensitive areas, but our students aren't trained in it. So for me, that's also a bit of a project, is how to better train our social science students in methods that actually work better for sensitive areas.
Fascinating. And so much of it is relying on online comments that you have to anonymize, or do you anonymize? And from below the line comments on news stories or websites, and I have a student looking at death in the media at the moment and bioarchaeology, news stories and how people react to them. And the changing regulations with X, formerly Twitter, meant that she could then mine a lot of the data from there. But perhaps that was a good thing for her mental health. But
Yeah.
but the point is, these are constantly changing sort of audiences, and how do we use this material, and in a sensitive and robust way. Yeah, absolutely. So these are all fascinating areas, but certainly with my TikTok videos, I've steered clear of showing images of the dead as much as possible in my public engagement. But occasionally, with content warnings, sometimes it's for archaeological topics, it's almost impossible to not. And I find there's a problem of audience and sort of bit of hypocrisy, because I've spent ages agonizing over should I use this image or not, and then you go to certain other social media sites and there's like images awash. And one of the most, I'll give you another anecdote that really frustrated me. It's no one's fault, again, really. It's just one of those dilemmas. Is I was invited to an archaeological excavation that was ongoing. It's a very well-known heritage site, but also they're doing excavations there. And I was videoing all the key directors and staff and stuff. But this wasn't, they said, oh, don't show the remains. We mustn't show the human remains. You've got to be very respectful of the human remains. I said, of course, I won't show any. I wasn't going to, but because it's you're calling it, how this is a site where people could locate it. You could get metal detectorists, you could get weirdos, all manner of things could go wrong if I just splurged onto social media. Here's a skeleton, and here's the the grid references of where you can go, and could have gone wrong. So I was all sensitive, and I got back home, and literally the next day on BBC News, archaeologists find human remains at the site of da 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 da, and I was going, and I thought. And that was literally the same people I was talking to. And I suppose where I'm going with this is they're thinking on, here's another academic coming with a mobile phone. We don't want him doing anything. Not that I would, but we need to make sure nothing goes online that could compromise the ethics and security of our excavations, right? I totally get it. But when it comes to the BBC, they're like rabbit in the headlights. Oh, fame, we've got to get the story out. And they think, well, hang on, this is probably seen by, no, I don't know how many would see that story. Tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people would see that news story. And my blog is not, or my TikToks are going to go to 1,000 people. And I just think, again, it's just an example of how we perhaps don't join up our thinking. And I'm not blaming them. I'm just saying it's just we're all doing it. We're trying to be sensitive, but also we're trying to get that story out there. And
Yeah, it is a tricky one, and it's like, with sort of, I think human remains is one of those big issues, isn't it? What you should and shouldn't show. There's greater sensitivities, and human remains come in different forms. It could be quite dry remains if it's sort of bones. That's far less offensive than if you've got more of the sort of flesh still attached to that.
yes, exactly.
Let's face it. Where and is this a video? Are you actually? Is it physically showing these remains if it's like in a museum or something? And then you've got the fact that you've got pictures of people that are being that are the recent dead, that are in mass shootings, etc., that are getting out there on social media, because we've got citizen journalists now. We all have the power of the mobile phone. And these pictures get circulated with very little thought about who could see it and what is being replicated. And I think, for me, it's not so much about the sort of human remains. I think the sort of archaeology, sort of having to grapple with those sort of boundaries. But I think the biggest challenge right now with the displaying of the human dead is about what's being circulated on social media, what is and isn't acceptable, and what is getting broadcast so fast that there is no thinking, there is no ethical sort of questions. And when I choose to use pictures of the dead in sort of my teaching, yes, try and do those sort of warnings and those sorts of things, but I'm not just showing bones. We are showing much more sort of contemporary bodies, and these bodies have often had violence conducted upon them. And the same with criminology, actually. When I'm sort of teaching on certain issues, when it's violence, sometimes those pictures need to be shown in a particular way. Sometimes they aren't shown. Sometimes actually using words to convey pictures is sufficient. So there's different boundaries. And, Michel Foucault with, in Discipline and Punish, he does a lot of the visual, but through words. How he describes things, it's as if you are there. So there's lots of different ways of showing the dead, whether it's through verbal or picture. You don't always have to see. You don't.
No.
But as someone who's teaching in the area or researching in the area, sometimes you have to make different decisions. You can't just stick with one way of doing it. It does depend on audience and story that you're trying to tell.
And I always, just to qualify that if anyone does raise a concern, I don't necessarily agree with that concern, but I always reflect on it and adapt. And I think that's one of the important things, isn't it, is if we are called out or challenged on what we're doing, that we do either justify it or retract it, and I think that's really important, is it's not being fixed in our ways and being, because the last thing I'd want to do is go to an excavation, take a photograph of a skeleton, but I've never done that and put it on social media immediately. And certainly, not when the site is still being excavated and the potential damage to those remains, because there's so many, people go, oh yeah, I'll go and do that. And yet when I open my phone, I see tourists, I see the public doing not much. And then when it's it's an ongoing criminal investigation, it's a different field completely. It's a different phenomena entirely, and it's absolutely shocking. So yes, I agree with you. I mean, it's small beans what we do compared with the broader phenomena of what we're seeing on in the media, I suppose. But we should be part of that conversation, even if anyone's listening. I don't know. But
yeah, absolutely. And I think it is a conversation. And I think it's about reaching out to people to get them to think about this and to think about the power of the visual, because the visual is powerful, really powerful. And it's once you've seen something, you can't unsee it.
No.
Once it's circulating in social media and all the rest of it, you can't get it back. So it's trying to get individuals to a point where they can make an informed decision rather than just a knee-jerk reaction. And that is a long-term challenge.
Thank you so much, Ruth. I don't know if you have any final thoughts or reflections or anything you had hoped we'd talk about that we haven't. Maybe we could have another chat at some future date. But any sort of concluding? Well, that was a great concluding point already, but anything else that you'd like to share with us?
I think my final thoughts are along the lines of, not being afraid to stay in this area, no matter what your discipline. And just to stress, let's just keep doing interdisciplinary approaches to death. If we stay in our fields talking about death and the dead, we lose so much. But by talking across disciplines, we can truly embrace the richness of studying mortality.
Ruth, it's been most sincerely a morbid pleasure talking to you.
Likewise.
and I really appreciate your insights, and good luck with all your ongoing projects, and well done for all the many different contributions you've made to this field so far. And it's just going to, hopefully this will inspire more people to pick up that mortuary baton, if there's such a thing. I
hope so.
Or keep the mortuary torch burning, or whatever bad inappropriate metaphor. But this is really important stuff, and I think I'm really pleased that we had this conversation. So thank you so much.
Me too. It's been a pleasure.
Follow Archaeodeath on YouTube, TikTok, WordPress, and a host of other social media.